Okay, so now we're going to be looking at adding another nice to have to our scenario here. So you can see that we really start with the core function, make sure that we can achieve that. Then we add on a nice to have, and then we might add on another nice to have, and then another nice to have, right? So we're constantly building on the base that we've already established and tested as working correctly, right? So here we're going to be looking at adding on, parsing out some information from those PDFs that we've been sent and uploaded into Google Drive. Now, one of the apps that I love using is Doc Parser, and it's relatively affordable, but obviously saves a lot of time, much more than it costs. So here we're going to be looking at uploading a document. Now, here we've got the option of uploading a document from a URL and uploading a document from a data from a file. You'll want to be using from a file, because if we tried to upload the document from Google Drive, we wouldn't have the permissions to access that URL unless it was in a public folder, and you probably don't want to have your invoices in a public folder. So here we've got access to the raw file here from the email, so we'll just use that as our mapping. Then we've got the option of selecting our Doc Parser ID. I'm just going to unmap that, and then I can select from my predetermined list. We'll put it into the invoice parser, and we don't need a remote ID, although I could put one in here. Actually, probably should put one in. We'll put in the Airtable ID. Now, the remote ID is basically going to give us a reference that we can use for when this document is parsed. We'll basically have a webhook that listens for that document data to be parsed out, and then this reference ID, this remote ID, is going to be how we're going to then attach that parsed information to, in this case, our Airtable database. So we're just going to put the ID of the record or the row that we created as our remote ID. And that's it. So now we're sending our PDF or our document to Doc Parser. The next step is we need to then set up our parser. Now, we selected the My Invoice parser, so we'll select that. And I've downloaded my invoice already, so I'm just going to drag and drop that into here. Now, the invoice itself is very simple. It's sent from Bubble, and it's got one line item, and it's got a total on the bottom there. So I've uploaded my invoice. I'm not going to do that. Now the next step is I click on I'm done uploading. Now I need to set up my rules for this document parser. So I go down to rules, and here's all the things that it's going to try and extract for me as a default. Now, Doc Parser have great default document parsing templates. Most of the time you can pretty much just choose one of those and it will parse everything correctly without too much configuration. We're just going to, maybe we'll see how this runs out of the box actually. So this one's apparently already processed, so we can click on that. Here we can see, well, it matched a date value and it converted that into ISO date. Looks like it found a date with an invoice number together, so we might want to refine that. Did pull out some emails. It looks like Bubble's email is first, and my email is second. Here we've got some line items, so it pulled the line item and then also pulled the total as another line item, so that's a bit off. And then it did pull total separately. Okay, so we might want to refine this a little bit. We'll go to the rules and we'll look at the line items needed refinement. So here they are. So we'll just click to edit, and here's where we can sort of see what's happening here. So here it looks like Doc Parser is using their table parser here, and the table rows are just out of place a little bit. So we're just going to readjust those. That can go there, and that can go probably there. That should be enough. So now if I confirm that, we should get the correct table row. We're still probably going to get total paid as a, yeah, we did, as a row. We could, if we wanted to, exclude that. We'll just say remove row. We'll just say we don't want to do row 1. We want to say we want to remove the last row. Although we're not probably going to be using that anyway, the line items, but I'd be looking at filtering row where it doesn't contain total, right? That's probably a good filter. And then you'd probably also want to remove the first row that it found, and then that will just leave you with the line item. So that's the parsing rule. Yes, reparse. Now, what you'll probably find is that you'll have to create a separate parsing rule for every document type that you're sending across, possibly for every sender. So what you will probably find is that you'll have to clone this, put that in here, and then you'll add into the filters here, you'll add a filter of the sender name or the sender email address contains Acuity or contains Bubble, etc. And then you'd have one doc parser for your Bubble invoices, one for the Acuity ones. That would be probably how you would have to build it. But here we can just rely on that pre-built invoice working. So now we've sent the data to doc parser. The next step is that we need a way to receive that data and upload it into Airtable. Okay, so now we need to have a separate scenario to listen for those documents as they're being parsed. So here we've got the trigger of watch parsed documents, and you'll notice here that we're uploading the document in one scenario and then we're watching for when that document is processed in another scenario. So there's going to be a slight time lag between those two. Could be a few seconds, could be maybe a few minutes, could be an hour, depends on how quickly doc parser processes things, and that probably likely depends on how many things you're asking it to process, what's the queue, and all their server capacity and how complex those documents are that it's processing, all those sort of things. But I'd say probably realistically about 10 seconds or so would be the upper limit for the most of the time. So here we want to watch for parsed documents, and you'll notice that it's an instant and an ACID trigger, and we want to add our webhook here. Now you can call this the invoice parsed, right? Webhook. I've already got the connection added. If you were adding multiple documents and you're parsing them out with multiple parsers here in doc parser, well, all of those documents as they parse, they're all going to go to this same endpoint, the same webhook, right? Because we haven't filtered the webhook for just one parser, so it's going to receive from all parsers. So if you're using a router here, here between the parser module, then you will most likely also have to put a router here because an Acuity document is going to have different data to what a Bubble document is going to have. So you might want to map those things differently. If you could set them up so that they both have the same extracts, which is going to be what you call these things, right? So if you wanted to have the same mapping, then I would name these the exact same, including case, and that way you can just select the same thing when it comes to this scenario and make your life a lot easier. Don't have invoice number on one and then invoice NO on another and then invoice hash on another. Now you've got to map three things, right? So just make it easy for yourself and use the same naming, and then you just have one thing to map. Okay, so back to our module here. So we've got our data coming in from doc parser. Next step is we need to push this data into Airtable, and we'll select our Airtable record. Now here where we already have our Airtable record, so we're just going to use the upsert module. You could also use the update module. I just chose upsert, which they both do exactly the same thing. The only benefit of using the upsert module versus the update module here is that if the record ID was blank for some reason, then the record would still be created in Airtable, but it would just create a new record and it wouldn't update an existing record. So yeah, you can add that. So remember, we put our Airtable ID in as the remote ID, so that's what I'm putting here as my record ID. And then let's just say we want to map in some data. Now you can see here that we actually don't have any data returned, so that might mean that we have to get data. So here we have to get our parsed document. Now here's where you would probably have to use, because here's where you're selecting different doc parsers. So now this is going to have one parser with this result, another parser with that result. We're going to map in the document ID, format of an object, which will be a standard JSON format. We don't need to include children. Now we'll let that run for a minute so it pulls in the metadata. So just wait a second or two and then click on the Airtable module. And then we'll see that now we have, looks like we got the exact same stuff. Normally you'd have the actual data being returned. Let's see, what did I miss? Upload, parse, list, looks like that's all correct. I think we might actually just have to run this. So let's just run this one here. And then I'm going to send a manual run from here. And I'm just going to requeue that for parsing. Okay, so now we've parsed that a second time. That should hopefully trigger this. If it doesn't, we might have to click to open and then send it. Webhooks, here we are. Ah, okay. So we didn't send any webhooks, so we don't have a webhook set up. So we missed that little step there. So we can click on Integra. Because Make upgraded, they haven't upgraded the integration here. So we'll have to use a standard webhook, simple webhook. And we can still build it, we just have to build it a bit more manually than we used to. So we'll select this here. Here's our webhook URL. We'll copy that from the clipboard. We'll go across over to here. We're going to put that in as our target. We're going to set JSON just to make it simple for ourselves. We're going to use a post so we're sending information. We're going to do one request per document. If we did one request per row, that would most likely be one request per line item, and we don't want to do that. We want to just send all the data as one thing. Then we want to select probably nested, although it probably doesn't matter here, we're not extracting that much information. But if you had, for instance, the invoice information, which would be like invoice number, email, billing address, whatever, total, and then you might have line items, which would be a nested array, a nested list within that invoice. Then you'd probably want to use nested here so that you've got the correct structure. For us, we'll probably just stick with flat. And then include all fields, yes, or you could just include, certain fields. Okay, so now we'll save that and test. And we'll send some test data. So here's our test data. You'll see that this is in JSON format. I do have a separate course that covers JSON and how to read it and how to write it in the advanced course. Here we've got, we're not going to go into that here, but here we can just run this now. Process existing. Here's our process, and looks like, yeah, so here we've just got flat, so we've got all of our line items flattened, and we can just ignore those line items. The only thing I want to map is the total, and that's here. So we don't need to get this now because we're getting all the data in our original data file. Now, if you are parsing from multiple documents, you'll most likely have to run this for each of the documents, test the webhook for each one, and then map each one as you test them. Because the data, as it's returned, all these data names, field names, they're all going to be unique to your document parsing template, right? So line items might be what you call it in one, but in another one you might just call it items, right? And so it's going to change the name here, which will mean that it's going to change the mapping. So that would mean that you'd probably have to put a router here, and if you'd probably put a filter on if document ID, no, it wouldn't be document ID. You'd want to do maybe template ID, something like that. Doesn't actually have template ID either. I would say it's probably going to be the document ID would be the template ID. One of those will be the template anyway, and then you can use that in the filter. So here we just want to map in the total, which will be total, and we'll select our totals here, total. Now you can see that that comes across as text. Now notice I hovered over to see what the data type was, and this is coming across as a text. So I'm trying to map text into a number field. Now that's going to throw an error when I try to do that. Even though it's formatted as a number, it's held and written as a string, as a text, and we can't put strings or texts into number fields. Now I know that this is a number field because I've got a little hash here on Airtable which tells me that it's a number field. I could also go over here and have a look, and it's a currency field, so that's a number field. So we need to parse this value, and we need to parse it into a number. So I'm going to select my number functions here, my math functions, and select the parse number. And I'm just going to put in the parse number here. Decimal separator is going to be a full stop, because that's what it looked like in the mapping. Yep, full stop. And so I'm just going to put that there. Now you can hover over this and over the function, and that will tell you what you need to put into the function. So you can see that it's expecting a number, which in this case is our string value. And so we're saying, well, our string value, our text value, represents the number. Then it's saying, well, I also need to know which decimal separator we're using. Are we using the European separator, which is a comma, or are we using the full stop, which is the US way to do it, right? So we have to then say, okay, well, this is going to be separated with a full stop, therefore, run it this way. Now, I think by default it separates by comma, so you normally would have to map that, always, pretty much. So that will now do that correctly, and we should... Yep, so see, we didn't have a record ID, remote ID parsed in, so, and I think that's probably because our test file we uploaded manually, which means that it didn't have a record ID. So let's just resend our test data again. Looks like that's sent. Run that again. We might have to refresh this page to resend the test. Yep, resend, there we go. Send the test data, success, great, there it is there. And we didn't get an error on our total, and we did get it mapped perfectly as a 39. So if we go over here, we'll see it's mapped here as 39. Now both of these aren't linked to anything, and that's fine because we manually uploaded to DocParser, so there was no record ID, remote ID to reference. So it just created those two rows. Okay, so that's adding DocParser to our Gmail invoice listener. We have covered a couple of extra things in there as well, but I certainly go into a lot more detail in the advanced course if you wanted to take it further.